So now that we've discussed how to play in the c-bet spots, the bet check bets, the check bet bets, all of that great stuff, we're going to take a look more closely at how to play against turn probes and barrels, and how to play against basically just various tactics that the big blind can be using in those spots. So let's start off with talking about the fundamental basics of this situation, and that is that when the small blind checks back, the big blind now has a little bit of an advantage in that they can have all of these strong hands that the small blind just can't have that often. Now, it's definitely possible for the small blind to occasionally check some strong hands back, but generally speaking, they want to be betting those hands to try and increase the pot size. So if you think about it like this, the small blind, when they check back, they have a more narrow range of hands now. They have more middling hands, still some air, but generally a more middle of the road type range. And the big blind still has the whole spectrum. So, if you call a raise, you're going to always check the flop. And if they check back, you now just have your whole pre-flop call range. You now have a much wider range of hands that you can have here than the small blind. Now, that's an advantage and a disadvantage. It's an advantage in that you can have a lot of good hands that can value bet. You can have a lot of semi-bluffs that you're going to want to bluff with. But you're also never going to have an opportunity to get rid of your weak hands by this point. So in this situation, the big blind has a lot of different hands. Now, a really important part of the small blind strategy here is to make sure that you float their bets often enough to where non-equity hands cannot float you. Now, the reason that that's important is because cannot probe. The reason that's important is because if you allow non-equity hands to probe the turn, then your opponent can start to counter you by betting weak and checking strong. Because if they bet a hand with no equity, they're going to make money with that weak hand. And now when they check, they can continue quite often against a bet, making more money against your range there as well, with more showdown-based hands and maybe some value bets to go for some raises on later streets. So it's absolutely imperative that non-equity hands do not get an opportunity to bluff on the turn and the river. Now, when I'm playing somebody, and let's just say that I check back on a board like Queen 9-4. We're going to be looking at the Queen Jack 10 high boards primarily here, but we're going to start off with talking about the overall spot, overall frequencies, and then we'll look at some examples on those boards. But when I check back on a board like Queen 9-4, and the turn's a 5, and my opponent probes, and I call, and they show down a hand like, let's just say 10-2, right? What that says to me is that on boards like Queen 9-5-4, they're going to have way too many bluffs unless they're planning on checking a lot of their draws. Because on a board like Queen 9-5-4, you have Jack 10, Jack 8, 10-8, 6-7, 8-7, 8-6, flush draws if there are flush draws, 6-3, 3-2 suited, probably combos of those hands, King 10, maybe King Jack. So there's so many hands that they could pick from a bluff with, and they picked one of their worst possible hands. Now what that says to me is, first off, I would anticipate a higher probe frequency, so I want to battle that more aggressively. But additionally, their checks are now going to be a little bit stronger because they're getting rid of all of these weak hands with their turn probe. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always doing that, but it's a snapshot into the way that they're thinking about their hands. They need to probe some of these non-equity hands because they think that they can get enough folds. Now, if they bet 2/3 pot, they're risking 2 to win 5, so they need you to fold 40% for their bluff to break even. As you get under 40%, they lose money. And as you get over 40%, they win money. Now, with the 10 deuce example specifically, when he rivers a 10, it's likely to be a card that he mainly wins on. So he does have some percent equity, but it's going to be very low. In order to deny that hand from being able to profitably probe the turn, you're probably going to have to float something around 37% of the time. So when we're looking at our strategy, it is imperative to maintain order in the small blind that we do not allow these probes that bluff opportunity, because if they can play like that, and I have played many opponents where this ended up kind of being how I played against them, if they do not need equity to probe the turn, a bunch of, the wheels really start to fall off the wagon. First off, you're really allowing them an opportunity to call you with pretty much anything pre-flop. And I've played some opponents where I realized that even though they were raising to 3x or whatever, they did a lot of checking back from the flop, and they folded a lot to turn probe. All of a sudden, you can play a ton of hands profitably in the big blind that you couldn't otherwise, because you're just getting so many chances to bet non-equity that you can play really loose and probe the turn 40 or 45% with tons of bluffs. And that's going to be a very strong strategy, even with nothing. You start to need very little, if any, equity to call pre-flop. There are some opponents where you just don't need cards to call pre-flop if they're going to check back enough and then fold the turn enough. So what you're doing by allowing them that opportunity to bluff you in the turn is they can call more pre-flop, they can bluff you more in the turn, they can check stronger, and they're going to start to have the ability to play many hands very profitably. Now, it's a little more complex than that, because if you start to see these things happening, you're going to adjust, you're going to fold less, you're going to start to check back stronger on the flop. You can work in some raise ranges, all of that kind of stuff. But the point remains that you need to, as a default strategy, prevent your opponents from having that ability to bluff you when you decide to check the flop back, because if you don't, all these bad things happen and your opponent's options really open up. So your goal is to not allow non-equity bluffs through once you check back the flop. And past that, you're okay with some of the semi-bluffs profiting. Because the thing is, when someone bets a hand like a straight draw or flush draw on the turn, you're just not going to be able to deny that bet unless you make your check range back on the flop too strong. So it's kind of one of those things where it's okay to allow your opponent that bet. When you do call, they're going to win 18, 20, 25% of the time, combined with their fold equity, right? So it's not really that bad for those hands to bluff. It's part of a good strategy, and it's not going to make that much money. But the non-equity is really important, because there are so many hands that are non-equity or just one overcard. And if you can't prevent those hands from bluffing you, your range is going to start to suffer too much. Now, earlier I showed a graph, I think it was a few videos ago, where my check back and fold was like 50% or something, and I was quite surprised. I realized that the reason that it was like that was because I had a lot of hands from 2012 in there, back when I was playing lower stakes and I was a worse player. So my averages were significantly higher. I now have my tree up from after around midway through 2013. Now, this is my c-bet and single raise pot, 50. We're not looking at that branch of the tree. We're looking at the checks. And we check back, and my win rate's actually also gone up here, which makes sense. So I'm winning at 3 big blinds per 100 when I do check back on the flop. And my opponent's probe and check are 34% probe, 66% check. So this 34% probe, this is about what you would typically expect to see. Anything between 35 and 40% is pretty reasonable. Maybe 34 is even a little bit on the low side. And I folded 40% to the probe. If I called, they barreled 59, and I folded 43% of the follow-up. So if my opponent was betting 2/3 pot, and they had actually 0% equity, this would be break even, and this would also be slightly winning. But here's the thing. When my opponent's betting 0% equity, these numbers aren't 40 and 43, because they have reverse removal. They block hands that I would be folding. I'm more likely to have pairs that call them down if they're bluffing. So against non-equity, these are probably more along the lines of 35, 38, or 30. Maybe the river fold's actually probably more significant. If they have a hand like 2 pair, these might be 45-50 or 45-55. But when they have air, these could be 35-38. So one of the misleading things about river folds, and I guess folds in general, is that you don't want to think about the overall fold, because I'm okay with having a high fold when my opponent has 2 pair. You want to think about the folds with the non-equity hands and with just the bluffs on the river. What's your fold like against those hands? And if you're looking at a 40% turn fold and a 43% fold to follow up against normal sizes, you are going to absolutely prevent non-equity bluffs. You're just not going to allow those through. And then what happens is their checks become very weak. And as we can see here, they probed 34, check 66. And when they checked, and I bet, which is this 42 number, my delay c-bet, they folded 54. So what happened was my opponents felt that they needed to really put their value in this turn probe and just kind of surrender when they check back, because I'm not getting these folds enough, or because I'm not folding to the probe enough. And what that allows is all of those checkbacks and then folds, this 40%. This is mainly bad hands. There's maybe a few weak ace high type hands as well, but these are mainly bad hands that checked back and can't continue. 10 highs, 9 highs, 5 highs. And now those hands are going into this 42 or this 42 where they're getting a lot of folds. So by protecting your turn probe, by protecting your check back range and preventing this turn probe with non-equity, you make it so that they have to check a lot of air or take a negative EV bluff. By taking a negative EV bluff, you're going to win more in this check line, and you can start to call out even higher than these frequencies. And by taking by forcing them to check a lot of weak hands, you're going to get great opportunities to bluff on these later streets. So essentially, the idea when we check back the flop, this is versus probe and barrel, we fold at 40 and 43, and versus delay probe, we fold at 38. The idea is that we're going to remove their ability to profitably bluff these hands, but barely. And I think the but barely is a really important part that a lot of players can kind of overdo. And the best example I have of this was when I was playing versus Ben Solsky in the challenge that we had in 2013, where if he checked back, he folded epically low to both probe and barrel and delay probe. And I realized that he folded so low that I could actually exploit him by using a full pot size where you're supposed to fold 50%. And he would actually end up only folding something like 30 or 40%, despite the fact that I was using a huge size and primarily value betting. Now, I still work in a few bluffs just to kind of keep him honest, but I'm looking at a range where on the river I should probably be 70-ish% value, and instead I was like 80, 85, 90% value because he was simply just calling down too much. So while of the two things, I think folding too much is the bigger leak. If you fold too much, their whole strategy can start to counter you. It still is a mistake to call too much. You want to deny the non-equity. You want to deny their ability to bluff the river, but barely. So if they make those decisions, they're slightly losing, but not getting absolutely massacred. Because if you try and massacre those bluffs, then what ends up happening is you can be countered by value betting. And it's always this game, right? It's this game of, does he fold too much? Okay, bluff. Does he call too much? Okay, value bet. But you want to make sure when you're making these adjustments that you don't go too big, right? Like let's say that my opponent decides to probe and barrel too value heavy. And I would say that in this sample, maybe that ended up being something that they did. They probably probed and barreled too value heavy. In that scenario, I think that it makes sense to maybe work on a few more folds on the river. But if you start doing too many folds, now they have more opportunity to bluff you. So this game starts to happen. What I'm recommending in these spots, and what we'll look at when we're looking at our combinations, we're going to strive to fold around 40% to the probe and around 40% to the river, okay? Given the standard sizes. And by doing that, it'll end up being 35% against the air and 45-50% against the value, meaning 55% when they have hands like sets. So our strategy will just default be good against whatever they want to do in the probe, and it'll offer us that nice bluff, those nice bluffs and those other lines that we talked about by protecting it with calling down aggressively. Now that means sometimes you're going to have to call down with hands that you're not that thrilled to call down with, because if you don't call down with them, then what's going to happen is your range is going to suffer too much to where, they get those bluffs. But we're going to try and draw that line between getting too spewy and calling down the appropriate amount. All right. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and start to talk about probe and barrel on some of the queen through 10-eye boards. We're going to spend this segment talking about that. We're going to talk about raise ranges. We're going to talk about how to deal with the high barrel. And, actually, before we move on to that, I do want to say just really quick here, I don't really believe, there's actually probably a better place to say it than in the following video. I don't really believe a lot in having a raise turn probe range. Now, certainly I think that part of a game theory optimal strategy would be to raise turn probe. There's no doubt about that. But it would be a very small percentage of our range, I believe, probably like a few percent, maybe 5%, something like in that vicinity. And the problem is by doing that as humans, it's hard for us then to really calibrate river raises. Now, there's several reasons why I think the river makes more sense. For starters, as we can see here, the turn probe is 34 and the river barrel is 59. So why raise our value on the turn when we're very likely to get a following bet by calling? Okay, that's the first problem. The second problem is that when you have value, they're more likely to be bluffing, so I want them to keep those hands in their range. And then third, by keeping all my calls into that range, I allow myself a much better opportunity to be able to calibrate river raises effectively. So if you wanted to take the time to develop turn raises versus probe, I think you could do that. I think it would be a lot of work for not that much gain. Maybe if you were playing someone that their turn probe was 50 or 60% and you felt that it was necessary to create that part of your strategy, that could be totally fine. But against the field, the probe frequency on the turn combined with the river follow-up, it doesn't really make that much sense to have that turn raise range because of how often they follow up the river. I will also say that, let me think about this call and then, I will also say this. It actually does make a little more sense if you're going to fold too much on the turn or you're going to fold too much on the river. It makes a little more sense to fold the turn than the river in these spots traditionally because the turn ends up being a low bet frequency and the river follow-up ends up being a generally higher one. So it's a much bigger mistake, and this is probably the most common mistake that I see in a lot of people's play. It's a much bigger mistake to call tons of turn probes and then planning on folding them on the river than it is to play too tight in the turn and then play appropriately on the river because, by folding a little bit too much on the turn, they aren't going to take that line nearly as much. Well, sorry, they're taking a turn bet there not as often as a river bet, if that makes sense. And additionally, planning to fold the highly barreled street doesn't really make sense because you know that when you call a turn, they're going to primarily barrel the river. So just floating them there to fold river isn't really a very good strategy, right? It's better to call planning and calling or fold there on the turn. We don't, though, this is what we do not want to do. We don't want to get carried away with that idea because then you start to fold 50% on the turn, your opponent can start to counter you again by doing tons of turn probe, and then when you call, check folding river. So we're going to start off aiming at that 40% fold, 40% river fold. We're going to talk about balancing out the river raise range. We're going to talk about how to bet when they probe and then check the river. And as you can see here in the sample, when people probe the turn, which is 34, and then check river, they fold 70% to that river bet. So that's an extremely good bluff opportunity, definitely a spot you want to take advantage of. And we're going to talk about how to allocate our calls effectively to not allow our opponent those non-equity bluff opportunities.